All right, today I'd like to talk about how I cross-cut boards down to length using handsaw. In my case, Japanese handsaws, both a Kataba or a Ryoba or a Kataba. And the technique I've developed to do this, I've vastly simplified the technique over some of the devices you can purchase at different woodworking supply stores that have overcomplicated the whole process of cross-cutting down to size. Hi, I'm Norman Perillo, a furniture designer maker at Perillo Design and a woodworking educator author at WoodSkills. So what I have set up here today is a sliding board jack and a couple of boards that I typically use for my joinery. This is a 2x3, which nominally 2x3, about 1.5 by 2.5, and this is 3/4 by 2.5, which is a 1x3 nominally. I'll give you an example of how I would cross-cut this down to size. Now, I use boards like this for the type of joinery I create. Here's an example. I create, for example, interlocking bridal joinery. I also, that's also using the 2x3. This is another version using a 3/4 or 1x3. So I need to cut these down to specific sizes. I need to have the end square on all the boards. That's the most important criteria of joinery, is to begin with a square end, both in both planes, both along the face and along one of the edges or both edges. So that's very critical. So how to do this without using a table saw or any other machine or powered circular saw or something. So I typically use hand saws in my work, and I typically use Japanese hand saws because they have a very thin saw plate and the kerf is very small, in the order of 0.5 millimeter, 0.5 to 0.6 millimeters. And if you use the crosscut side of either of these, well, the Kataba is already set up. This Kataba is set up for cross-cutting with fine crosscut teeth, and the Ryoba is a little different. It's a double-edged blade with both crosscut and rip tooth patterns. So this is almost the same pattern, but this goes deeper and it's a more versatile saw. So I use this a lot. I also use the Kataba, has a slightly thicker saw plate, so sometimes I can use this and it's a little quicker to use too. But I like this one too because it goes deeper. So what I've developed is a small jig that actually serves to align the edge of the saw plate along the cut and keep it square in both planes, along the face and along the edge. I've vastly simplified it, so this is probably the third or fourth iteration of the jig. And this longer portion goes along the face, and the shorter portion is along the edge. And it works well with both of these dimensions, the 1x3 and the 2x3. I just guide the saw along the edge of this jig, this sawing jig, without any magnets or anything to hold the saw plate against it. It's just a matter of developing a technique and understanding how to keep the saw plate against the wood, and it hardly ever gets, it doesn't get damaged at all. So it's just two pieces of wood that are rabbited to each other with some reinforcing dowels. And what I've also done is applied a thin sheet of sandpaper on each of the inside edges to keep it from shifting. So you can either hold it by hand against the board. Here's an example here. And this, it doesn't shift at all, so you can keep it locked in while you're sawing. Or you can clamp it, and I'll give examples of all this coming up. And the end result is a very square end. And I think this is one of the, possibly one of the ends I've already cut. These are ends that I've already cut. You can see they're very, very fine, almost better than off a table saw, actually, to be honest. And they're square, in both planes, along the edge and along the face. So that's what I'm striving for. So I use this jig, and it's versatile because you could actually use the saw against one edge or the other edge. It depends on the length. And so it's just a matter of marking a piece of wood off with a fine point pencil or a marking knife, and then emphasizing the line with a fine point pencil, and then beginning the cut. And after 2 or 3 tries, you'll find that all your cuts are perfectly square. In my work, I like to simplify processes and techniques, so I don't have to give it much thought when I pick this up. It just works really well. So I'll give a demonstration of that coming up. So to give a demonstration, I'll just give you an example. If I needed to cut off maybe a 1/2 inch off this end of a board, I'll just mark the board off. So for example, if it's a 1/2 inch, I just need the one mark, and then use a small square to extend that along one face, and then I carry it around. Now this isn't even important. As long as you have one mark set up, you're okay. But I just want to give you an example of and of course the bottom's not critical at all. So I'll set this up again with the sliding board jack, and I'll set it up in the vise. Now you can do it either using the jig I was referring to manually. You can hold it, because it does have that sandpaper for grip. So in this case, the face is longer than the edge, of course. I'll use the longer edge along the face and the shorter edge along the edge, and I'll move it over. Now I could, again, hold it by hand. So I'll give an example of holding it by hand, and I'll clamp it in, and I'll even give examples of both the Catawba and the Ryoba. So I'll start with the Catawba, and this is I would cut the end off. So the important part is to keep the saw plate against the sawing jig. So you start to cut. Again, it's a pole saw. It's a Japanese pole saw. And keep it against, and keep it light, so as not to introduce any flex in the blade. Keep it against the... You'll find that once you've established the minimum amount of kerf in the wood, the saw itself is guided through into the wood on its own. I'm going a little faster than I usually do, but put that aside and move this off. So this is holding the jig with your hand is the absolute fastest way to do this. And you can see that how clean the cut is. It's actually exceptionally clean. And we'll measure it for square. Perfectly square in that plane, and perfectly square in this plane. So that's an example of how to cut an end off a board. And actually, this is already prepared for prep for joinery now, so I don't have to true it on a shooting board or anything. So it saves a considerable amount of time using a simple jig like this. Now I'll do the same cut. I'll perform the same cut using. I won't even mark it this time. I'll just give an example. I'm going to approximate 1/2 inch or so using the clamp and how to clamp it. So again, the long edge along the face, and we'll move it over here, and we'll use the clamp, just a small adjustable clamp you can almost buy anywhere. So this clamp, you keep it away from the edge you're going to be cutting, of course, and it just brings everything together, the jig, so it then becomes far simpler to cut. So I'll instead of using the Catawba, I'll use the Ryoba in this case. So I'll cut this now. using the So let's have a look to see how square this is. It's perfect in this orientation and perfect in this orientation. So it's very, very square and just off the Japanese saw. So and the cut itself is exceptionally clean and smooth, because of the tooth count on these Ryobas and these Katabas. So it's a beautiful system. No need to use power tools again. You can use either the Kataba, and it comes in different versions, crosscut or rip, but you need crosscut for this particular type of crosscut cut, or the Ryoba with 2 blades, rip, crosscut. And this is probably the better versatile saw for a beginner to Japanese handsaws. And you can of course use Western handsaws also, as long as they don't have a spine on the back. So what I like about these saws is they don't have the spine, so this works really well for deeper cuts, deeper cross cuts using this system. So I don't typically use a Dazuki unless it's a very shallow cut. Dazukis are primarily oriented towards a dovetail, that type of joinery cuts. So that's a system, and it works really well. And again, the saw cut's pretty clean. Again, I'll test this for square, and it's in both planes, along the face, perfect, and along the edge, perfect. So I don't even bother even checking anymore, because I know it's going to be perfect right off the jig or right off the sawn surface. And what I do like about this very much is how fine the cut is. It's exceptionally fine, even much cleaner than off a table saw or any other machine. So it's ready for joinery, and that saves me a considerable amount of time in my work. So I'll put this aside, and I'll set up a larger board now. I'll set up a 2x3, nominally 1.5 by 2.5. Set it up in a face vise. And it's a sliding board jack that I use, that I've developed. It's shown in earlier videos. For example, if I'm cutting this here, so I'll just set this up. You can either hold it by hand, but because of the size of this board, I prefer to actually just use a clamp. It's fast. It's just as quick, and guarantees a good result. So that's about 1/2 inch that I'm cutting off, and the jig, of course, is squared to the board, and it's about almost exactly 1/2 inch. Got it. So I'll use the Kataba. It's actually not as deep, but it's cross cut, and it works just as well as the Ryoba. The Ryoba's a bit deeper, but it's a more versatile saw, and it's a good introductory saw, Japanese saw to purchase, because it has both crosscut and rip teeth. So I have several of these now. I'll go ahead and cut this. The important part with Japanese saws is, again, pull stroke. You need to establish the cut correctly. And again, keep the saw plate against the jig. That's important. So when you're sighting down, make sure the saw plate's against the jig, and if you want an extra guarantee that it is against the jig, you can even hold it using your fingers. Hold it for a while, for about 1 inch or so, and then it's established, the curve's established, so you don't really need to. Now, I don't normally mix and match saws, because this saw plate's I think it's 0.6 millimeter thick, and that's a 0.5. keep your saws consistent when you're doing this because of the different results you can have. There's something else I'd like to mention. I used to rotate the wood to ensure that the cuts is in the same plane on both ends. So this ensures a square cut, but I find I don't even have to do that anymore. Using this jig, just cut straight down automatically because of the saw plate against the side of the sawing jig. Let's see what I've done here. That's 90 degrees, 90 degrees, and we'll check this face, 90 degrees, right across. So that works, and again, it's a super fine cut, which is exceptional if you're doing any type of hand-sawn joinery, and that's what I do typically. Again, these are examples of this has already been glued in. Here's an example of a mitered bridle joint. So I need both ends to be square, both board ends to be square before even beginning to create the joinery. Yes, I've been demonstrating this type of joinery, these bridle cuts, these mitered bridle cuts in slightly earlier videos using a miter jack saw. Well, that's interesting too. So that's a miter on this size, and that's actually a square miter. Or a full miter. Sorry, it's not even a miter. It's a bridle joint, a square bridle joint, not mitered at all. I was going to miter it at some point, but then I decided to keep it square. So that's these are pieces I usually work with, and that's that. So again, it's very simple to create. It's just two pieces of wood that are rabbited together for reinforcement, and interlock and keep the faces square to each other or flat in the same plane, and then I reinforce it with 4 small 3/16 inch dowels. So you can make several of these at once in different scales, different sizes, depending on the type of wood you're cutting, the components, the size of the components, the scale of your work. And then I, of course, insert some sandpaper here to hold it by hand. And you can also determine the length of the both edges. This edge is longer. This would be along the face, and let's just show you, this would be along the face, typically for the type of wood I use, and this other edge is for the edge, one of the edges, or either edge, and of course you can saw from, I'm left-handed, well you can saw from either side, of course, along either face, and the important part is to keep the saw plate against registered against the face of the sawing jig. So just to summarize, I use this system extensively in my work to cross-cut boards down to size. I much prefer it to using any powered equipment, and again, I'm a large proponent of using hand tools in my work, and I've been drawn to Japanese saws in the past year and a half. So I typically use a Ryoba, because it's more versatile and they're fairly inexpensive. And I use a Kataba for cross-cutting. It has a slightly thicker saw plate of 0.6 millimeter as opposed to 0.5 typically for this. It's actually stamped on the saw plate, if I can find it, at 0.5 millimeter. So that's, I think, 20 thousandths. So that's what I use. Normally I use bench hooks to cut boards or components down to size, but that only works to a point. It only works for smaller components, and it works really well. again, because you have both a fence and an edge to work against. When you have larger boards, then it becomes a little more bulkier work. You need a different system, and then so instead of taking the board to the bench hook, I take something similar to the board, clamp it in, and work with it there. So it works with most workbenches. Again, all you need is a face vise. This jig, which is incredibly simple to create, it's just 1.5 inch square stock, I think, 1.25 inch square stock. Rabbit it together with 4 reinforcing dowels, and cleaned up and ensured that the faces are square to each other, and some sandpaper applied on the inside. And you can scale this up to, that's the only size I've made so far, but I can scale it up or even reduce the size for even smaller components if you need to take this to the, and you don't have a bench hook available or something. So, and you also don't need to finish the edge, the sawn edge on a shooting board, which is a huge advantage, especially for something this size. If you're cutting a board of this size, this length, cross-cutting, so you can't really use it on a shooting board anyway, because the end is so clean. So it's amazing. It's a factory edge almost, or factory end. So that's what I use, and try it out. Very simple to create, and hope it works for you as well as it does for me. So please subscribe to my YouTube woodworking channel, where I share more of my woodworking techniques, my woodworking philosophy, my thoughts on woodworking, and all the challenges I've experienced. And I introduce some of the new forms of woodworking I've discovered. And also visit woodskills.com, where I have a good selection of my books, both in print and digital format, on woodworking, and all my online courses, and I also offer some woodworking plans. I have maintained a regular blog on what I've got going on in my workshop and in woodworking in general. So enjoy.